In early 1965, I was in Kansas City where I was addressing my first really major seminar. When the seminar was over, I headed back to my room expecting to have a lonely dinner that evening. But as I stepped off the elevator, the booming voice of a man I've come to know and love as a brother sounded out, "Zig, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to dinner." He said, "Wait a minute." He said, "I'll go with you." It was Bernie Lofchick from Winnipeg, Canada. When we sat down, you have seen it happen where men just become instant friends. And I don't mean just buddies, I mean really close friends. We had about the same size families. His daddy died when he was very young. My daddy died when I was very young. He'd gone to work very early. I'd gone to work very early. He had gotten in the cookware business. I'd gotten in the cookware business. I mean, it was just an amazing thing. We sat down for dinner, and I said, "Bernie, you've certainly come a long way to a sales meeting." He said, "Yeah, you know, it really was magnificent. I got some wonderful ideas." Said it really was a great experience. Well, I kind of persisted, you know. I was going to find something negative to say there. So I said, "Yeah, but it sure cost you a lot of money to come from Winnipeg, Canada, down to Kansas City for a couple of days." "Well," he said, "you know, Zig, thanks to my son David, I don't really have to worry about money." I said, "Bernie, that sounds like a story. Would you share it with me?" He said, "Yes, I will." He said, "When our son David was born, our joy literally knew no bounds. We were elated. We already had our 2 girls. Now we had the boy. That's the family we wanted when we got married." But he said, it wasn't but a few days before we realized something was wrong. David's head hung too limply to the right side of his body. He drooled too much to be a normally healthy baby. But the doctor said, "Don't worry about it, he'll outgrow it." But you know, Zig, Bernie said, when it's your baby, you worry about it. We took him to a specialist, and the specialist, this was after about 6 months, the specialist, incredibly enough, diagnosed him with a condition he identified as the reverse of club's feet, and treated him for that for several weeks. But Bernie said, "You know, Zig, we knew it was more serious than that." So we went to another specialist. And this specialist, after a very exhaustive examination, told us, said, "This little boy is a spastic. He has cerebral palsy. He's never going to be able to walk or talk or count to 10. I'm going to suggest that you put him in an institution for his own good and for the good of the, quote, normal members of the family." But Bernie looked at me, and with those dark eyes of his flashed, and he said, "Zig," but he said, "you know, I'm not a buyer. I'm a seller. I could not conceive of my son living the life of a vegetable and growing up to be absolutely a nothing. I saw him in a different light altogether." So I asked the doctor if he knew of any other doctors, and all this specialist got highly indignant. He stood up. He said, "I've given you the best advice you'll ever get. I suggest that you take it." And the interview was over. Bernie Lofchick didn't take it. He went to another specialist who told him the same thing, and then another, and another, and another, and yet another. 30 different specialists said, "There is no hope for this little boy." Then they heard of a Dr. Pearlstein from Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Pearlstein was reputedly the #1 authority in the world on cerebral palsy. But he was so busy that he was booked for 2 full years in advance. Bernie finally got his home phone, called him there, made an arrangement so that if there was a cancellation, that David would have the first alternate. Just 11 days later, a little boy from Australia canceled, and they bundled David up, flew him to Chicago for the examination. It was probably the most comprehensive physical that any child has been given up until that point. I mean, they really spent hour after hour after hour going over the baby. They threw out all of the other findings, all of the other x-rays. They just started from ground zero and went on with the examination. They called in the best expert in the world to read the x-rays, just to tell them what was there, to make no diagnosis, to make no recommendations, just tell me what you see in the x-ray. When it was all over, Dr. Pearlstein and his nurses sat down with the Lofchicks, and they said, "This little boy is a spastic. He has cerebral palsy. He's never going to be able to walk or talk or count to 10. If you listen to the prophets of doom. But he said, I happen to be solution conscious, not problem conscious. I believe there's something which you can do for this little boy if you are willing to do your part. The Loftics rather obviously said, well, doctor, you tell us, we will do anything that is humanly possible. Now, at that time, they could not easily afford a very heavy financial burden. But they said, spell it out, doctor, and we'll do what is necessary. And in minute detail, he said, you're going to have to work this little boy beyond all human endurance. Then you're going to have to work him some more. You will have to push him until he literally falls, and then you're going to have to pick him up, and you'll have to push him some more. You're going to have to be patience personified, because there will be many, many months where you will be unable to detect any progress at all. But if you ever stop, he will go all the way back, and then you will have to start all over. You're going to have to understand this is a lifetime commitment you're making, not something you do this year, next year, 5 years, or whatever. This is from now on. Well, the Loftics took David and they went home. They hired a physical fitness expert and a bodybuilder. They built a little gymnasium in the basement of their home and they went to work. It took a number of months before David could even move the length of his own body. One day, many months, probably about 2 to 3 years later, Bernie received a call from the therapist. He said, I believe David is ready. Come on home. Bernie Loftic rushed home. David was down in the gymnasium on a mat getting ready to do a push-up. And as that little body started to rise into the air, the physical and emotional exertion was so great, there was not a dry inch of skin on that little body. The mat looked as if you had sprinkled water on it. When that one perfect push-up was complete, Mom and Dad, the 2 sisters, David, the therapist, and several of the neighbors who were over there broke down and shed the tears which clearly say that happiness is not pleasure. Happiness is victory. The story is even more remarkable when we learn that one of America's leading universities had also examined David very carefully and discovered that there were no motor connections to the right side of his body. They had said to him, he has no sense of balance. He will never be able to swim or to skate or to ride a bicycle. On October the 23rd, 1971, my wife and I were in Winnipeg, Canada, to see little David Loftic at his bar mitzvah. I wish you could have been there. I wish the television cameras of the world could have been there to see what we saw. That young boy, 13 years old, whom the doctors had said would never be able to walk or talk or count to 10, at that point in his life had already done as many as 1,100 push-ups in a single day, had run 6 miles non-stop, was doing extremely well as a 7th grader in 9th grade math at St. John's Ravenscourt School for Boys. He was running the wheels off his 3rd bicycle, was skating on the neighborhood hockey team, was one of the best table tennis players in the city of Winnipeg, Canada. The next year, to the best of my knowledge, he became the first, and so far as we know, the only victim of cerebral palsy to qualify for an unrated, ordinary $100,000 life insurance policy. The reason I share with you so many of the details of David's story is because it involves the principles that we've been talking about all the way through. First of all, there was the foundation, which is solid. They were absolutely honest with the Loftics, and the Loftics in turn were honest with David. Character is, as Calvert Roberts says, the ability to carry out a good resolution long after the excitement of the moment has passed. It's one thing to agree with the doctor, you're going to do this for the next 15 years. It's another thing to do it for the next 15 years. Integrity, no question, all the way from day one. Loyalty, you've never seen a family that were so one as the Loftic family is. Trust, Don't you know that the trust had to be incredible? 3 hours every single day from then on in, David had to be in there working. Don't you know that when the doctor said there'll be years and years when you won't be able to see any change, that involved an incredible amount of trust? How many of us, for example, would have been willing to have hung in there all of that length of time? Love? One of the most beautiful love stories I think I've ever heard is this one. When David was about 2 years old, they had to start putting heavy leg braces on his legs every evening. And they had to make them progressively tighter. And every evening when Bernie and or Elaine would put those leg braces on, David would be there literally with tears in his eyes. And he had beautiful green eyes. He was a beautiful child, coal black hair, olive complexion, with tears in his eyes, saying, Mommy, do we have to put him on tonight? Or, Daddy, do you have to make him so tight? Now, don't you know that any mother or father in existence would really have had trouble with that one? But Bernie and Elaine Lofchick loved David so much, they said no to the tears of the moment, so they could say yes to the laughter of a lifetime. See, when you really love someone, you do for that person what is best for that person. Attitude every night when they were putting David to bed. First Elaine and then later Bernie. When he would come in every night, he would awaken David and he'd hold him in his arms. He'd say, Son, you're a chimp. You can do anything you want to do, son, and Dad really loves you, and Mom really loves you. He was one of the first people to get a cassette recorder. In those days, they were just coming out. And every day while he was taking his therapy, he would be listening to the motivation while he was taking the therapy. Self-image, obviously, as a child, he could not have a good one as an infant, but today, of course, he does. Relationships, probably nobody has ever worked as closely with and in better cooperation with others than David Lofchick has been working all of his life. Goals, we talk about daily goals and long-range goals and big goals. David Lofchick had literally hourly goals on many occasions. Nobody has ever worked a minute harder than David Lofchick. Desire, when you start talking about desire, you're talking about a youngster who surpasses just about anybody in anything I've ever seen. The physical effort that went in all of this is absolutely astronomical. And David Lofchick, for 1 solid year, set his opportunity clock 1 hour earlier than any other member of the family. And when that clock would sound off, he'd get up and put his skates on, go out to that frozen swimming pool. And it took him 1 solid winter just to learn how to stand up on the ice. Later, he skated on the neighborhood hockey team. You've heard it said many times throughout the series that you can have everything in life you want if you'll just help enough other people get what they want. One of the interesting phenomena of this is that Bernie and Elaine Lofchick, in the process of providing David his opportunity in life, Bernie not only had to work smarter, but he also had to work harder. For 7 years, Bernie Lofchick worked 7 days and 7 nights every week. He took off 1 Friday night in 7 years in order to provide the financial necessities for giving his son everything he needed. Today, Bernie Lofchick is an extraordinarily wealthy man. Well, what's the end of the story? Well, the story's not ended. That's the reason we can't really end it, but I can bring you up to date. David Lofchick today is a handsome young man of 29 years of age. 195 pounds, a barrel for a chest. Happily married, a proud papa. And for the last 2 years, he's been the #1 condominium salesman in the #1 real estate firm in Winnipeg, Canada, having a marvelous time and a marvelous career. The principles he learned as a child are standing him in good stead now and will for the rest of his life.